So shall I begin? In 2022, the nation, that's all 4 countries of the British nation, acquired a library, a very extraordinary library, which is now known as the Blavatsky Honresfield Library, a catchy little title. It was put together at the end of the 19th century by a man called William Law, who was a northern English industrialist living in Rochdale, Lancashire, and Honresfield is the name of his house, which is why it was originally called the Honresfield Library. He put it together at the end of the 19th century, and it's a library that's extraordinary in many ways. First of all, it's extraordinary because he was a British industrialist, amassing a huge important library of manuscripts and books at a time when, in fact, the axis of collecting was moving westwards towards America. He was often in competition with J.P. Morgan, who is a rather better known collector than he was. So he's a man who's been hidden from view, but actually is equally important with Morgan. For instance, William Law amassed the largest private collection of the writings of the manuscripts of Robert Burns and of Walter Scott and of the Bronte siblings, the 4 Bronte siblings. So quite extraordinary. Another thing that's extraordinary about the library is that William Law died in 1901, and thereafter the library descended through the collateral line of the family. He had no issue himself. And it's been largely hidden from view. So it's been what you might call a sleeping beauty of a library, really, in that after about 1925, almost nobody entered the library. So very quickly mysteries developed around the library. You know, what did it contain? What was still in it? What had been sold? And so on. Since 1925, I only know of 2 scholars who've actually entered the library. So hidden from view. But thirdly, and I've kind of already suggested this, that what Law collected was probably the largest private collection of 19th century literary manuscripts. That was his focus. It was largely writers like Walter Scott, Robert Burns, the Bronte siblings, Jane Austen, Byron, a little bit of William Cooper too. It was writings that by authors who were almost still in touching distance of Law himself. His house, Honresfield, was 20 miles from, it's still standing, 20 miles from Haworth. Charlotte Bronte was 20 years old when William Law died. She was already a celebrity in her lifetime, and it's quite clear that Law certainly knew he possibly knew Charlotte Bronte, certainly knew her by sight, but he knew those who worked for the family. He knew her servants and others in that sort of relationship circle. So very important library in that sense. Alongside the rich collection of manuscripts, there's also a large library of printed books, 1,800 printed books of various qualities. Law was, in terms of manuscripts, he was a very discerning collector, and his manuscripts are in conversation with one another. For instance, the 2 Byron letters he collected, one of them talks about Byron's own interest in Burns. Byron himself owned a Burns letter, and the other of Byron's letters talks about Byron's estates in Rochdale. Byron was the 6th Baron of Rochdale. So, you know, Rochdale, so important to William Law too. Walter Scott, huge influence on the Bronte sisters. So there are all kinds of, as it were, affiliations across the manuscripts. When it comes to the printed books, Sarah and I have been looking at many of those, and that's a much more eclectic collection. A lot of interest in Northwestern books, so books on Northwestern dialect poetry, huge interest in witchcraft and in chapbooks. He was interested in demotic literature, literature of the people. Also an interest in early plays, and curiously, I think too, a strong interest in what were for him modern women writers. So he has Wollstonecraft, he has Jane Austen, he has many of the Minerva Press women writers too, like Anne Radcliffe and Maria Roach. So an interesting collection. It became known, the collection, in 2021 when the owners brought it to Sotheby's, and it was going to be dispersed through 3 auctions across the second half of 2021, at which point the Friends of the National Libraries, which is a large charity in Britain, devoted, rather like the Art Fund, but devoted rather than to paintings to works of literature, the Friends of the National Library stepped in and managed to stop the auction and to persuade both Sotheby's and the owners that if we could come up with a valuation that was independently arrived at for the library, then it could be saved for the nation. The library was valued at £15 million, which is a huge amount for literary works. I mean, it's nothing. It wouldn't even get you one Van Gogh's Sunflower in terms of paintings, but huge amount for literary works. And in fact, in just 6 months, we managed to raise £15 million, the largest amount of money ever raised for, as it were, for a single, as it were, item. If you think of the library as a single item ever for literary works in Britain. So the money was raised at the end of 2021, and what's happened is it is now a dispersed national collection. Many of the manuscripts have gone back to the places where they were originally written. So Walter Scott's gone back to Abbotsford, his home, as well as to the National Library of Scotland. Robert Burns has gone back to the Robert Burns Birth Trust Museum in Alloway in Ayrshire. The Bronte manuscripts, many of them have gone back to Bronte Parsonage Museum where they were written. And the Bodleian Library, along with Jane Austen's house in Chawton, were allocated to Jane Austen letters which were in the law collection, as well as several printed books. And we have the letters here now. The letter here, the one where you can see the red blob of the sealing wax, was written when Jane Austen was 20 years old, and it is the first surviving letter from Jane Austen to survive in documentary form. It's number 2 of the letters in the standard edition, but number 1, although it survives in print, has not survived, as far as we know, as an artifact. So this is the earliest surviving letter of Jane Austen's. It's also exciting, not just because it's her first surviving letter, but because in it she mentions her love affair with Tom Lefroy, and certain groups of readers get very excited by that. She talks about dancing her last at a ball with Tom Lefroy and how the tears flow as she thinks of the fact that this will be her last encounter with this man. So it's a nice letter. Also in it she's writing the letter, both the letters are written to her sister Cassandra, and also in that first letter she talks about writing for fame and not for pecuniary emolument. So it's a lovely phrase. Whereas this later letter, she's very much into pecuniary emolument. It's written when she was 37, so it's 17 years later. And you'll see she's writing a tighter, closer hand. It's a more mature hand. She's writing it from London, from Henrietta Street, Covent Garden, where her brother Henry lives. And she's on a trip to London. And she does all the things that you might do on a trip to London. She has her hair done. She goes to the theatre. She also visits the dentist, which not so much fun. And she goes shopping in Bond Street. And she talks about the reputation that's growing for Pride and Prejudice. So it's a wonderful letter full of different kind of biographical detail about Jane Austen. And we've got alongside that, we've got some of the printed books that were acquired two by the Bodleian from the Blavatnik Honresfield Library. I should say that only 161 of Jane Austen's letters are known, and of those, that's in print, and of those, many have not survived. So Jane Austen letters are extremely rare, and they're extremely rare in public collections in this country. The lion's share of Jane Austen's letters are at the Morgan Library in New York. So to have a couple of Jane Austen letters is a rare treasure indeed. Some of the other objects are really quite curious. I chose this one over here, which is an edition of a Charlotte Bronte little book. The little books, many of the little books that were still in private collection were in William Law's collection, and they're now back at the Bronte parsonage. And this is one of the little books that was acquired in 1895 when a man called Thomas J. Wise, some of you will have heard of him, he's a slightly dodgy bibliographer, as many bibliographers tend to become. He was what's called a creative forger. And Thomas J. Wise in 1895 sent Clement Shorter, a journalist, over to Ireland to visit Arthur Bell Nichols, who was the widower of Charlotte Bronte. Charlotte Bronte had died in 1855, so this is 40 years later, in 1895. And he was on a fishing expedition, and basically he bought from Arthur Bell Nichols everything that Nichols was prepared to give him. So huge tranche of Bronte artifacts, manuscripts, memorabilia of various kinds. The story is that Wise said he needed them for a biography he was going to write, and that thereafter he would give them to the Victoria and Albert Museum. But within a year he was selling the manuscripts. And this is one of the manuscripts, and it's a year later, 1896, and he's editing it. He says, thanks to the courtesy of Harry Buxton Forman. Harry Buxton Forman was a colleague in forgery with Wise, and he'd already sold the manuscript on to Buxton Forman. There is no suggestion that any of the Bronte manuscripts are forged. In fact, there's no suggestion that Wise ever forged manuscripts. He didn't forge manuscript, he forged printed editions. So none of these are forged, but this is a copy. If you turn it over, no, turn it to the front, you'll see it's the front free end papers. You'll see that it's a copy that he gave to William Law. And he gave it to William Law within a month of selling to Law what is generally seen as the greatest prize in the Honresfield collection. And that is a manuscript notebook of 31 poems penned by Emily Bronte. When the library came onto the market in 2021, this little notebook was described as the holy grail of Bronte studies, and it was estimated by Sotheby's to achieve at auction £2 million. Law, it was in the Law collection, so he'd already sold that to Law by 1897. We don't know what else he sold to Law. There's no catalogue of the Honresfield Library that's certainly been made available to us anyway. But he also is giving Law this as well. So it's a very nice little connection, both with Honresfield and with Thomas Wise and his less than honest dealings with the Bronte archive. That's all I'm going to say, really.
And just very quickly, just so that you know what you're looking at on this side of the table, these are 3 of the books that we acquired from Honresfield. We were given 41 in the end as part of the breakdown of material from the consortium. This is the earliest book that we acquired. This is a copy of the Theatre of Cruelties by an Oxford student called Richard Verstegen. No copy of this survives in Oxford, despite the Oxford connection. Printed in Antwerp in 1587, and it's full of very grisly photographs. Pictures of photographs. Oh, great! Pictures of the martyrdoms of Catholics by Protestants. So it's basically a response to Fox's Book of Martyrs. This is another Oxford interest book. These are proof pulls from illustrations that would have graced the top of the Oxford Almanac. So for those of you that know what the almanacs are, they're big sheets with a picture of an Oxford view. This is a whole set from the mid-1760s to about 1802-03, and if you turn the pages, it just goes from view to view to view. This is not a printed, published book, but an album somebody has put together of these loose proofs, probably from the Oxford University Press. And finally, this is a first edition of Northanger Abbey and Persuasion. The library was quite late to acquiring Jane Austen novels. We don't really get the first one into the library until the 1840s, as far as I can see. Despite legal deposit bringing lots of fiction in. And we've got 2 other copies of this already in the library, neither of which are perfect. This copy is perfect. So finally we have a perfect copy of the first edition. So please everyone come up and have a look. If you want us to turn pages, just ask us and ask us lots of questions.
Oh, we should say as well that
yes.
this book here, which is a bargain at £5,
In the shop.
it really is a bargain, in the shop, was put together by those of us who worked on saving the library, and Sarah and I both have an essay in it, so it's definitely a must.